I always do.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this webinar. I'm excited to present on Articulate Storyline. It's quickly become one of my favorite tools to work with. As Dan mentioned, I do work in the template library, so I'm constantly creating different templates, constantly designing for Articulate Storyline, and a lot of different products. But again, Storyline has become one of my favorite products to work with. Now, just a couple housekeeping items. I can't hear you, and we have a lot of people online today. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question and answer spot on the right-hand side. And I have somebody online, Parker, who will be answering those questions, the questions that he can. And if there are questions that he cannot answer, I will try to stop every once in a while and take a look at those questions. Now, with this many people, I'm not going to get through all of the questions. I can guarantee that up front here. But I will try to answer as many questions as I can, and then we can go from there. Or if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at eLearning Brothers as well. I'm more than happy to do that. Now, Parker is also live tweeting, so if you follow with the hashtag ELBchat, any comments about this webinar or any questions that you want to ask Parker as we're going through this, feel free to type in the ELB chat in your hashtag, and we can respond to that as well. Okay, we do have starter files and slides for you to download. These are starter projects, the files that I'm going to be working with, the slides that you're seeing. You can download these from the bit.ly/ELB files URL, and that will allow you to download the same slides, download the different interactions and games that we'll be building, so you can mess around with those and learn how to build these different interactive content pieces inside of Storyline. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this presentation. Now, if you go to eLearning Brothers template library, let me go ahead and go to that real quick. And this is found at library.elearningtemplates.com. I'm going to post that just in the chat, just so you guys can go to it. And if you hover over activities and come down to Storyline Games, we have a lot of different games to choose from. Now, these games basically are built directly inside of Storyline. So we didn't use any other tool. We used exactly the functionality that Storyline offers you, Articulate Storyline, to build these types of games. So a couple questions that I want to ask at first is, I want to know, what type of Storyline users are you? So I'm going to go ahead and start a poll here. And I want you to quickly answer this. Are you a Storyline ninja? Do you have a lot of experience? Are you kind of a semi-pro? Are you in the minor league? Are you a newbie? Or do you even know what Storyline is? Let's go ahead and see where our audience is here. Okay, I'll just give you 2 seconds here. Okay, so I'm going to share the results. So you can see that the majority of you are newbies, and this is a good thing because we're going to be starting out with Articulate Storyline. We're going to be showing you how to go in and to use a little bit more of the advanced stuff. Like we're going to talk about variables. We're going to talk about triggers. We're going to be talking about various different things. And so if you are a newbie, you've never really opened it up or anything like that, we do have more in-depth training that I'll share at the end. But for now, just basically try to soak in as much as possible, and we can get you started with creating some really interactive, some engaging games. For those of you who are Storyline ninjas, well, this might be a little bit more of a kind of a review for you. You're more than welcome to stay on the line, but we're going to be talking about just those basic things. We're going to be talking about triggers, conditions, and we're going to be talking about variables. And those are really the three elements that help you build an interactive game, help you build something that is really, built inside of Storyline that helps you take your training to a whole new level rather than just using the normal timeline. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I just wanted to make sure that I asked that just so I can see where everyone is at before we get into the content here. So What I'm talking about when we're building these interactions is I'm not talking about building like a World of Warcraft or a Halo type of game. Unfortunately, Storyline doesn't have that capability to go that in depth when you're wanting to build something like World of Warcraft. But it allows you to take something and instead of just building like a standard quiz with your multiple choice questions, true or false questions, instead of just doing something like that where you see this plain Jane type of quiz that you can see on a piece of paper, well, why not make it more engaging? Give the learner some type of objective. Give them some type of reason to try to answer the questions and see how well they can do. When you do that, you actually get better results in your quiz, even if you have a standard quiz at the end. I remember working with a client, and in the client, they had a boring HIPAA training where it was just standard content. Their quiz scores really weren't that good. They they basically wanted to see how they can improve just their quiz scores. Well, what we did is we implemented simple games like this. So we gave them some type of objective, and we still had the standard questions, true or false, multiple choice. But because we made it a little bit more engaging, we actually saw that the results of the quiz shot up drastically. So even building something like this will help you um, with your quiz scores if you're still trying to, if you still have a quiz within it. Or you can use these types of games as your final quiz. There's a lot of different possibilities with it. So now there's different types of games, different types of interactions that we can work with. One of them, I like to categorize it into two different things. One is like a game or a type of a map or basically a game board. So in the case of this game show game, which is a Jeopardy style game, this is more of like a game board. So you have different pieces on your game board, and when you select that piece, it'll actually take you to your question. So you can try to answer that question. If you get it right, then you get the points. If you don't get it right, then you don't get the points, or you even lose the points. So that's a one type of question. Another type of game is a map type of game where you can take the learner through a different progression inside of the map and take them to different points. And as they ask those questions, they go through those different points. So the learner has some type of objective, some type of goal, and that's really where the gaming comes into play. As well as our millionaire game where they try to get to $1 million in order to win the game. And then another example of our map game here. So I'm going to first of all, before we get into, I'm going to show you how to do this because I am more of a how-to person. I like to show you exactly how to get in, exactly how to click the buttons, exactly what to use inside of Storyline. But before we do that, I want to talk about what I've learned working at eLearning Brothers as important parts of the interaction or important parts of the game if you're building a game. So the first part inside of Storyline that I like to do is I like to structure my interactions all on slide layers. Now, if you're a newbie or if you don't even know what Storyline is, this basically, Storyline allows you to build interactive games and interactive training for your online, for your learning management system or something like that. So as far as Storyline, when you're building these types of interactions, there's a tendency to build the different types of questions on different pages. Well, when you're doing that, when you're trying to actually copy over different pages or trying to work with different pages, there's a whole lot of room for error, which I don't like. So in order to condense this, what I like to do is all of my questions become into or actually get placed into slide layers. So question one, question two, all the feedback I'll actually work with inside of slide layers instead of going to different pages, linking to different pages. And that way, when you actually copy and paste that game, you only have to copy and paste one page. If you're working or if you're saving it as a template, then your coworkers only have to work with that one page. And so that's one little tip that I want to share is when you're building these types of interactions, you're building these types of games, make sure that you do that inside of layers, and you'll get better results that way. Now, as far as game structure, one important part that you want to have inside of your game is the intro page. Now, we really like to make our intro page just really stand out, to have the logo, take a lot of time designing the logo and have the logo be the very first thing that the learner sees. Now, the reason why is because this basically envelops the person in the game. So it kind of takes them out a little bit and says, hey, you're not in your normal boring training anymore. You're in an interactive game. So the learner perks up a little bit and says, oh, wait, this is fun. So they think gaming, this is fun. So their mind starts to get engaged already with just even looking at the logo. So if you're developing these games, I would definitely recommend that you take the most time on your logo. And then after that, it kind of cascades into your design for everything else. Now, so just like we have in our games, let me go over to our template library just to show you. I'm going to go into our one of our games. I'll go into the game show. So we have this logo for the game show that comes up. So here's our logo. We have a continue button. The next thing you want to do is you want to have an instructions page. Now the instructions page will allow you to get out any instructions that you need to for this game. And this will be like tips and tricks or anything like that. But another thing to do is if you want to personalize this game, you might want to have a text entry field here. And if you have a text entry field, the learner can actually, and you can place this anywhere inside of your instructions. And if you place that, it would actually, you can place this inside of a variable, which we'll learn about here in a little bit. And then you can use that variable, you can use that throughout your questions. And so if you want to personalize the question to the learner, well, this is a great way, great spot to say, hey, let me know who's playing. They type in their name and they go on to the question, and the question says, hey, Jeff, did you know? Or blah, 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 just whatever you want it to do. But it's a way to personalize the game to make the learner feel like they're actually enveloped in the game. So that's the next part that I think is really important is the instructions page. Tell the learner how to play the game so they're not wondering, okay, how to play it throughout the actual game. There's also a tip that you want throughout the game is if you want to put like a little help button. I'll show you a little feature that it works really well that the learner can click on a help button and get more information throughout the game. And then there's a game board or map like we talked about. So on any game, you want to give the learner some type of objective. For this Beat the Banker game, it's a deal or no deal type of game. So the objective is to try to pick a winning case and then to continue throughout the game until they've actually got and to see how much money they can end up with. So that is one objective. Let's go back into the template library and let me just show you all of our different games and talk about different objectives for all these games. So, and I think that's one of the most important things. In order to make it a game, you really have to establish some type of game board, some type of map, some type of objective for the learner to actually complete. So in this case, the game show, they have to go through the different things and see how many points they can get, pick the different squares, see how many points they can get. With the shootout game, they basically go through and see how many points they can get, and they either make a goal or they don't make a goal. It gets blocked by the goalie. Beat the banker, you try to see, like I mentioned, you try to see if you got how many points you can get through the cases that you choose and the cases that you eliminate and everything. And then the map like Explorer games, you're basically taking the learner through the different points of the map and they try to get to the completion point. They try to get to the end point in order to complete the game. So that's a very important part is to make sure that you have some type of game board or some type of map that the learner has these objectives. Now, when they click on something from that map or they click on something from that game board, then this is where the learning element comes into play. So you can either have your basic questions like multiple choice, true or false, or you can do default things inside of Storyline like drag and drop. So you can have a drag and drop question, you can have any other type of interaction at this point. But this is the learning part of the actual game. This is where they get the points. And so if they get it right, they get the points. If they don't get it right, then that's where the points, or you can either take away the points or you can actually have, just not have any points added. So, but also before I became a computer nerd, I was actually studying psychology. And one thing that I thought was important was also the immediate feedback. There's a tendency to not give the feedback. I've noticed that for other people to not give the feedback until the end of the quiz or till the end of the game where they can scroll through. I disagree with that. I think immediate feedback is better. So as soon as they answer a question or as soon as they actually select something and hit submit, and I know there's people who argue with me, but I think that you should give them immediate feedback saying, hey, good choice, but you might want to keep this in mind. So giving them the immediate feedback on the games, I think is very helpful and will allow the user, especially if you're going to allow them to retry the game, it'll allow the user to improve because the idea is to improve. You want the learner to actually learn the content. You don't want to, sound smarter than the learner. You want the learner to actually learn the actual content. So why not give them immediate feedback that's helpful so they can retry it and improve their score? And then once they've done that, you take them back to the game board. You show them, okay, this is your progress. You answered this, you selected this case, and so you take that case away and you say, okay, this is the points that were taken away, or this is the option that was selected, or this is your point in the map. So that's really where the game board comes back into play. So any games, you have your game board, you have your map, you answer the question. If you get it right, you progress. If you don't get it right, then you don't progress. But you take them back to the game board so they roll the dice again, basically. And then the last thing is the conclusion page. Let them know how they did and allow them to try it again. Now, you don't have to allow them to try it again. I'm very much for allowing them to try it again so they can improve themselves. And then at the end, this is where I saw with the client that I mentioned before. At the end of this, if you're following this same type of progression, the same type of process, if you allow them to try it again, they're going to keep trying to improve their score. Well, that's good because then when they go to their quiz, you go to the final quiz. If you still have a final quiz, then their scores will improve because they've kind of refreshed and they've practiced over and over what the content was before they actually got to the quiz. So that's the structure that I wanted to talk about. If you use that structure inside of Storyline, you can build some awesome games. And that's how our structure, or all of our games are structured, is to allow you to do those types of things. We have the game boards, we have the questions, we have the feedback, and then we take you back to the game board and then at the end show a conclusion page showing how you did, what the results was, and everything like that. So I just wanted to pass that information along first of all before we got into the actual nuts and bolts of programming inside of Articulate Storyline. So there's three key things when you're programming. So we're going to switch gears here, and I'm actually going to show you how to start programming these types of things. And there's three things, keeping in mind of all of our games, all our interactions that we've done. I've identified these three things as the key points of building these types of games. And the first thing is triggers. Triggers allow you to have something happen when something is clicked on, or when something is hovered over, or when something is selected, or something like that. Now, the triggers that we're going to be talking about are changing the state of a certain object. Well, if you have a game board and the person selects on that briefcase and they go to that question, well, when you come back to that game board, you want to basically change the state of that briefcase so they can't select it again. Because if they select it again, they'll go back to the same question. So changing the state of an object is an important part when you're building the games. And I'll show you how to do that here in a second. Now, showing the layer and navigating to these different layers. Like I mentioned before, I like to structure the game on layers. I don't like to structure it on different pages. So showing a layer and hiding a layer becomes a key trigger inside of Articulate Storyline. So I'm gonna make sure that you know how to show a layer inside of Storyline. The next thing is the lightbox slide. Now, like I mentioned in that kind of setup, you may want to give the learner special instructions through different questions or helpful hints. Well, having a lightbox slide inside of Articulate Storyline is how you would do that type of thing. How you would give them special instructions, how you would actually allow them to see some helpful hints throughout the game or throughout the different questions. Play media, I am very much for playing sounds, giving them immediate sound feedback. If they get something right, why not have like a ding, or why not have a buzzer if they get something wrong? So, I mean, they hear the sound before they actually register the text. And so if you can associate that type of sound with the correct or the incorrect, well, why not do that? That's just one more kind of implement into how the learner learns, basically, is giving them immediate feedback or giving them even vocal audio feedback or something like that. And then adjust variable. We're going to be talking about variables more in detail, but adjusting the variable is how you have a score, how you have a true or false or settings like on and off type of thing, or how you store some information like the learner's name that you're going to use throughout it. So we're going to be talking about that. And then the last thing is execute JavaScript. If you're going to count this game as your final quiz, well, you have to run some JavaScript in order to do that. unless you use the quiz functionality inside of Articulate Storyline, which there's some restrictions with that as well. So I'll share that code with you as well. And don't worry, you don't need to be a JavaScript coder. You just need to know what these 3 lines of code that are going to be in there, what they do and how you can use them basically. All right, so before we get into variables, let's go ahead and take a look at how to use some of these triggers. Now, for those of you who asked for the link to download the files, let me go ahead and copy those, and I'm going to paste them into chat. Those files are allow you to download the slides that I'm using, and it will allow you to download the files that I'm going to open up here inside of Storyline. So Storyline you can find, for those of you who are completely new, you can find at articulate.com, and you can download a 30-day trial, and this allows you to build interactions, allows you to convert PowerPoints over to online training. Well, I'm going to go ahead and open up a project, and if you've already downloaded these files, you can follow along. I won't be stopping because it's a webinar. We don't have a lot of time. I won't be stopping to allow you to try it. So if you want to follow along with me, that's fine, but just keep that in mind. So the first file, and you'll see when you download these files, you'll see 3 different folders. You'll see starter files, you'll see finished files, and you'll see slides. Now the slides are the slides that I was showing throughout the webinar. But the starter files are the files that I've already set up visually for you, and you'll just need to come in and add the triggers and add the variables. Or the finished files are the files, these same ones, the timeline and our Beat the Banker ones, are ones that already have those variables, already have those triggers. If you want to pull those up and just take a look through them and see how we did them, you're more than welcome to do that. So I'm going to click on, first of all, the starter files, and I'm going to come into timeline. And this is going to pull open my Storyline. And it looks like I already have that one open. So I'm going to come into Storyline, and anytime you open up Storyline, the first view that you're going to see is the story view. So in order to get to a page, all I have to do is double click on that page, and that will come into my page inside of Storyline. Now, like I mentioned before, when you're building these types of interactions or you're building these types of games, keep it all on one page. That way, when you want to copy it, or you need to know, okay, does this page associate with this game? Or there's just too much confusion, in my opinion. So if you keep it all on one page, you use something over on the right-hand side called layers. Well, these layers you can navigate to by selecting on the layer title. And you can see as I navigate through them, I can have different text, I can have different images on these different layers. And so it just kind of keeps it all in one page, but it still allows you to have different types of visual looks and different types of updates on these different layers, basically. Now, the other thing that it allows you to do is it allows you to have one base timeline with all of your objects, and then from the different layers, you can call those base objects, and you can manipulate them from your different layers, which we'll talk about here in a second. But this layer right here, or this interaction that we're starting with, is our timeline interaction. Now you can find our timeline interaction on our template library. And our template library, if you hover over activities, go down to storyline interactions, and then you go down to timeline. Let's just take a look at what this does first of all before we go in to start programming it. So the first thing is we have an introduction page. Down at the bottom, we have a timeline separated into 3 different sections, and we have different points that when I hover over them, will show a little text pop-up. As soon as I click the begin button, it's going to take me to my content 1, and it's going to show me some information. And it's going to have a little text box, a little pop-up over here, and next and a back button. Well, if I click next, it's going to now go to point number 2. And the little pop-up here will now show over point number 2, and that just lets me know what point I'm at in my timeline. So this one is a simple interaction, and this is why I wanted to start out with this one first of all, so we can get used to using triggers, get used to using variables to create something as simple as this, and then we can get into the games. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to basically make sure that my next and my back button, because when the introduction is showing, I don't want to have my next and back button showing. So I need to select my object, come into the states down at the bottom, and under the initial state, select the drop-down box to hidden. And that way, this will not be visible when the learner first comes to this introduction. Well, I could go a different route. I could take my next and back button and I could paste it on all of my different layers here. Well, if that's the case, you're just adding more to your file size. There's some benefits to just have one next and back button and program it a little bit different so it still works. So the first thing I need to do is when we click on the begin button, we need to add a trigger to go to the next layer. So it's a simple trigger, and the triggers are found over on the right-hand side of Storyline. Now, when you're programming in this, if you're programming in Flash, or if you're programming in JavaScript or any other type of coding languages, you have to memorize different things, memorize the structure of it, and you have to type it out by hand. Well, Storyline is a whole lot easier. It actually just is drop-down boxes. So all you have to do is select the object and come over to the right-hand side, click on Create a New Trigger, and this will pull open with the Trigger Wizard. So there's no having to remember these different types of functions and variables and the way that you structure different things. It's just selecting these different options. So the first thing I want to do is select the drop-down box, and this is all of my different possible triggers that I can do. Well, if I come down here, all I have to do is select where it says Show Layer. We're going to do a simple trigger here. And then I have to select the layer drop-down box of which layer I want to show. Well, since this is the begin button, the first layer is going to be the timeline 1. So I'm going to select timeline 1. And then I happen, okay, when is this going to show the layer? And I select user clicks, or I could do user double clicks, or when the timeline starts or when the timeline ends. There's a lot of different possibilities, but I'm just going to stick with user clicks for now. And then that means the object is when the user clicks what? Well, we already have it selected, so it's already here that it's going to happen when the user clicks the begin button. That's when it's going to trigger. And so now I can click OK. So if I preview this, and you preview it up on the top, make sure you're in the Home tab. If I click on the preview button, now just a simple trigger allows me to navigate by clicking on the begin button to the Content 1 page. Well, on the Content 1 page, you'll notice that the begin button kind of disappeared. Well, if you come into the timeline, and then let me stretch this out a little bit, you'll notice on your timeline for Content 1, I selected Timeline 1. If I select the drop-down box, you have the option to hide and show different things on your base layer. So I decided, but just by clicking on this little eyeball, I decided to hide the begin button. If I didn't do that, let me uncheck that again. You'll notice that the begin button will be visible when I come to this layer. So I don't want that to happen. I just simply hide it at that point. Well, one other thing I want to do is I want to change the state of an object, because if I go back to Storyline here, or if I go back to my preview and I come to Content 1, I want to visually show down at the bottom that they're on Content 1. So I want to change the state of this object. So we're going to add another trigger, but we're going to add that trigger when we want it to happen. So that's the key. You need to make sure that you're adding the triggers in the right spot, in the right layers. Otherwise, you may have stuff happen when you don't want it to happen. So I'm going to come into Timeline 1, and as soon as we get to Timeline 1, I want this little pop-up down here on the base layer to show the label, and to not just on the hover state, but to just always show the label. Well, I'm not really adding this type of trigger to any object. This is just going to happen when the timeline starts. So that's the key, is if you're thinking these through, that's the key, is as soon as this timeline starts, I want that to change the state of a certain object. Well, if I come back to the base timeline, click on that object, you'll notice under the states, this is where I have my little pop-up on these hover down and selected states. So coming into Timeline 1, and this is another benefit to working with layers, is you can access objects from your base layer. So I'm going to click on this trigger, create a trigger, and I'm going to select the drop-down box to change state of. And I'm going to change the state of any object on my stage or any object on the base layer. So I got to select what object it is. What object am I changing the state of? So I'm going to select the drop-down box, and I'm going to go down to the circle. And another thing, if I can just for a second, make sure you actually name your objects, because when you're creating inside of Storyline, you're creating shapes. So if I'm just going to create a shape here, you'll notice that Storyline gives it a default name of rectangle, circle, or whatever. Well, when you're adding these triggers, that's really confusing. So you want to make sure that when you have an object selected, that you come down and you double click on the name and you give it a name that you'll remember. So when I come into my timeline 1, click on add a trigger, select the drop down box to change state of, and go down to the drop box here, or the drop down box for on object. I'm going to come down to timeline 1, and I'm going to change the state to selected, because selected is basically that means that it's selected, that it's always going to show that state. And I'm going to do that when the timeline starts on timeline 1. So as soon as it comes to timeline 1, it's going to show that. I'm going to click OK, click preview, and there we go. As soon as I hit the begin, it's now going to have that pop-up automatically show. And we use changing states a lot. If you come back into the game show here for Storyline, I'm going to click on the game show. I'm going to go into my game board and I'm going to select one of these objects. Well, here's my question. If I click on correct and then continue, it's going to take me back to my game board. Well, how do I let the user know that they answered that question? Well, I changed the state of that object. Each object on the stage has a green and it has a red little outline. And so if they get it wrong, I'll change it to the red outline. If they get it right, I'll change it to the green outline. So this is how you go in and this is basically an important element. That's why I wanted to show. This is an important element of changing or letting the user know that they've already visited something, or making it look different, or having a little pop-up box is changing the state of. So I wanted to make sure I focused on that. Okay, so another part, let me come back into my keynote here. Another part is, so we talked about changing the state of, we talked about showing the layer. Let's go ahead and talk about working with some variables here before we get into our game. Now, the question for you is, what is a variable? If you're completely new to programming, if you're completely new to Storyline, you may not know what a variable is at all. So I looked up on Wikipedia, the most helpful resource ever, what a variable is. So, and the definition was actually very helpful. It said a variable is a storage location. So Storyline has some piece of information that you want to just kind of keep there, that you can then change, that it can be changed and it can be adjusted at a later time. So what kind of information would you store? Well, there's 3 different types of information that you can store. Now, those 3 different types make up the different types of variables. What types of variables are there? Well, the first type is text. The second type is a number, and the third type is true or false, which is kind of like off and on. So text can be any type of text. So if you're going to use the text field, or you're going to use the true or false, when you add this variable, and I'll show you how to add it inside of Storyline in a second, this is useful for like settings, questions, if they answered a question, if they visited, or if they've clicked on a certain button. You can have a storage location of a variable called visited, and then you can change that from a default of off to a default or to on, and then if it's on, then you can take them on to the next page. If it's off, then you basically restrict them from going on to the next page. So that's where true and false variables come into play, and we'll take a look at how to use those here in a second. And then number, well, what do you use for numbers? What's important about a number variable? Well, a number variable is where you store scores, which is very important when you're creating games, percentages, page or question counters. If you're going to have create your own question counter or kind of your page counter, then you would store that inside of a number variable. And then the last thing is text variables. Well, text variables become important if you're going to create words or other types of just regular text. So if you're going to have the user input their name and you're going to use that name throughout the course, well, you create a variable called name or something like that. And then you use that variable whenever you want the course to actually display the user's name. And so that's just kind of a brief introduction to creating these different types of variables. And I wanted to show that before we get into the next part. When you're creating the next part of this interaction, you're going to have the next and you're going to have the back button. You're going to, because we're working with one next and we're working with one back button, you're going to need to check a variable. You're going to need to know which timeline that you're on. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to establish a variable. And this variable is going to keep track of which timeline that they're on. So the way that you establish a variable for any project is coming over to the right-hand side and clicking on this X button. If you click on this X button, this shows you all of your variables inside of Storyline. Now, in these variables, you basically can store some information. That's what the variables do, is they store information. Well, we want to store some information of what current page that they're on. So I'm going to come over to the bottom here, and I'm going to click on create a new variable. And I'm just going to say timeline, or let's just type this current timeline. Now, you can't have any spaces in your name, so you can just capitalize each word just to make it so it's readable, just whatever you want it to do. It really doesn't matter, but it does. The variables can't have any spaces in them, so that's the only rule there. Now, I establish here a type of variable. Well, we talked about the three different types. We talked about true and false, we talked about text, we talked about number. But because I'm keeping track of what number of timeline we're on, then that's the type of variable that I want to use. Is I want to use the number of, or I want to use the number. And then I established we select the drop down box, and I established the default value. Well, if I'm going to start from the introduction page, well, I just want to have that default value as 0. So I'm just going to click OK, and then click OK there. So that variable is there. We haven't used it inside of our programming. We can use that, but it's a storage. Variables basically store information that we can then access and we can change at a later time, which is exactly what we're going to do here. And even though I'm just working with the timeline interaction, this same process goes into our game. So just keep that in mind. So what I need to do is I need to adjust the variable to know on each of these timelines, so we know which timeline that they're currently on. So I'm going to come into timeline 1, and I'm not establishing a trigger on any object. I'm just basically going to do it on the timeline. I'm going to come over, click on create a new trigger, and I'm going to select the drop-down box to adjust variable. We want to take that variable that we created and we want to adjust it to reflect what page we're on. So I'm going to select the drop-down box to current timeline. And then I'm going to select from here, I'm going to say equals, okay, the current timeline variable on this timeline is going to equal a value. I'm going to select the drop-down box of value of 1. So now I know that this is going to be 1 when the timeline starts. So now from here, all I have to do is copy that and then paste it into my other timeline. So I come into timeline 2 and I click on this paste button right by the triggers, and that will paste it here. But on this timeline, all I need to do is change the number to 2. So I'm going to select the number here. And if I need to go into it, I can double click on it to pull up the trigger wizard again. But in this case, I don't need to go into it. I could just select whatever's highlighted here and change that to a number 2. And then just come into timeline 3, paste that in, timeline, just change that to 3, go into timeline 4, paste that in, change that to 4, and then go into timeline 5 and paste that in and change that to 5. So I'm taking that variable in each of my layers and I'm adjusting it kind of behind the scenes. It's not really doing anything yet with it, but I'm just adjusting it. Say, okay, if they come to timeline 4, that variable is set at 4. If they come to timeline 3, that variable is set at 3. Well, that's useful information because now we can establish our next and back button to go to different pages or different timelines based on what the current one is. So if the current one is timeline 1, then the next button is going to go to timeline 2. If the current one is timeline 3, then the next button needs to go to timeline 4. If we're currently on timeline 4, the next button needs to go to timeline 5. And then if we're currently on timeline 5, the next button probably needs to go back to timeline 1 and just kind of goes back into a loop, which is exactly what we've already set up inside of our timeline here. So if I go in back into Storyline Interactions, hit begin, click on next, you'll notice it just goes through the different labels there. Let me just pause to make sure there isn't anything urgent. Okay, so nothing urgent here. I am going to continue on, and then at the end I will go through some of the questions that Parker isn't able to answer. So Okay, so we have that kind of set up. We know that exactly in those different timelines we're going to adjust that variable. Well, we need to come into the next button, and we need to trigger going next and back based on that variable. So I'm going to select that trigger, and I'm going to come over to the right-hand side and click on Create a Trigger, and I'm going to show the layer, and I'm going to show the layer timeline 1 when the user clicks. Well, okay, but how do we know it's timeline, or how do I know when to show timeline 1? Well, that's where the third important part comes into play, and that's conditions. Okay, show timeline 1, but only show it if these conditions are true. And you can establish what those conditions are. So the way that you access conditions is by coming down to the bottom left-hand side, and if I click on Show Conditions, it will pop open with different conditions that I can establish for this. So the first one, if I come down here and click on this plus button, this will pop open with a condition. And again, you had to do this, if you're programming an action script, you had to do this all by hand. So storyline is just a bunch of drop-down boxes. It is a whole lot easier than trying to learn how to program this by hand. So the condition is we want to say if the current timeline is equal to, and we have a greater than, less than. For now, we're just going to worry about equal to. And we're going to say equal to 1. Click OK. That's going to be in our inside of our timeline, and then click OK. So now it's going to show timeline 1 if the current timeline, actually, we don't want to show it if the current timeline is 1. We want to show it if it's 0. I forgot to change that. Or actually 5. We would want to show timeline 1 if it's 5, because if it's 5, it's going to go back to 1. So, and then we want to do the same thing for the other one. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to hit copy, and I'm going to paste it on the same next button. So on the same next button, I'm going to hit, you can have multiple triggers. So we're saying, okay, show timeline 1 if the current timeline is equal to 5. Well, show timeline 2, and I can just select the drop-down box here, if the current timeline is equal to 1. Because if it's 1, that means we're currently viewing the content for 1. And we're going to show number 2 if they click on the next button, if the timeline is equal to 1. So it's a little confusing, but taking a look at that, you'll get used to it. I promise it does take a little bit of practice. And now I can go in and copy that and do the same thing for all my others. So show timeline 3 if the current timeline is equal to 2. So it's just basically 2, 1, 3, 2. It just kind of goes back there. If it's timeline 3, then you're checking the current timeline if it's 2. Do the timeline 4, and I'm going to do timeline 4 if the current one is equal to 3. And then the last one, show timeline 5, select the drop-down box if the current item is equal to 4, if we're currently on page number 4. Okay, so final thing is I need to come into my timeline 1, and these next and back buttons are hidden by default, so I need to change them to be showing, because right now they're set at the hidden state. So one more trigger I need to add. If I click on Create a Trigger, select the drop-down box, I'm going to change the state of the next button, select the drop-down box, the next to normal when the timeline starts. And now if I hit OK, that's all I have to do. If I come back to my main timeline, hit Preview, now I hit the begin button, there's my next button, and if I hit next, you'll see that I was on timeline 1, I went to timeline 5. Actually, I forgot to do one thing. So if it's currently timeline 1 or equal to, okay, let me take a look at this real quick. Now, if I need to check what the variable is at any given time, just here's a little tip for you. If you come into the Insert button and then you go down to Text Box and then you click on just anywhere in the text, you can actually display what the variable is. So I'm going to actually, and you do that within percentage signs, an open percentage sign and a closed percentage sign. Now within there, you can actually type in current timeline. You type in the name of the variable that you want to display. So now if I hit preview, hit begin, you'll notice that the current one is 1. So if I hit next, for some reason it's going to 5. So I'm going to go back in here. So if timeline is equal to 1, should show timeline 2. Okay. Yeah, it should show timeline 2. I don't want to spend enough time just kind of troubleshooting that, but it is navigating to different spots, and you would do that based on the variables. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's how you would use conditions. That's how you would use triggers to navigate to the different pages. Well, if I close that out and I come into a new one and I come into our Beat the Banker game, we would use that same type of functionality for navigating through the different questions or for going to the game board. So if I come in here and I click on this game board and I see like my title here, you'll notice over on the right hand side is my different layers. So it takes me to my instructions, takes me to my game board right here where I have my different objects, takes me to my questions, my correct, my incorrect, feedback here, and then my question and my conclusion. So that's how I have it set up here. Well, if I come into the initial one, I can just simply select my play button, go ahead and create a trigger, and it's a simple just show layer. So I'm going to show the layer for introduction. So I'm going to select the drop down box for instructions there and click OK. Come into my instructions, click on the start game, and I'm going to go into the game board from here. Say, OK, let's go into the game menu, click OK, and now it's going to go to the game menu. Now, in the game menu, I need to link my different briefcases to different questions. So I'm going to select my first briefcase, click on Create a Trigger, and do the same thing that we did before. So select the drop-down box and go to question 1 and click OK. So now I've gotten to the point where I'm at question 1. Well, on question 1, I want to add some points to my score if they get it right, or I want to take away some points if they get it wrong. Well, I do that inside of a variable. So that variable is also a number. So if I click on, actually, let's do one more thing before we do that one. Let's have a spot to enter in the user's name here as well if we want to make it a little bit more personable. So if I click on Insert, come up to Text Box, let's go ahead and just type in your name. I'm going to move that over to the right hand or left hand side there. And then I'm going to go back into Insert tab here, and I'm going to come into Data Entry. Now this data entry will allow me to gather the user's name. So basically, I'm going to come in here and just place this spot here. So if I preview it, inside of Storyline, I have a spot to enter in some text and then continue. And what that will do is this will store it inside of a variable. By default, over on the right-hand side, we have a text entry variable that automatically gets set. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm going to come into my variables, coming over to the right-hand side, and I'm going to delete this text entry variable, the one that automatically gets created when I use the text entry field. I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to create a new one. And I'm going to name this one name, and I'm going to leave the default value as none. So if they don't enter in a name, it's not going to show anything. And click OK, and then click OK here. Now, over on my text entry trigger, I do need to make sure that I also, since I switched it out to a different variable, I need to make sure I select the drop-down box to the correct variable. So what we're doing is we're setting the name equal to the typed value when we move on, basically, or the control loses focus is what it's called. So now on my question, what I can do is I can come into this text and I can say, hey, Jeff, or hey, name, and you do that the same way that I did with my number variable. You can put inside a percentage, the 2 percentage signs. You can type in the name of the variable, name right there, and that will display the name of the person taking the course or taking the game. So if I hit preview here, hit play, go ahead and enter in my name, hit start game, and go to question 1, there's my name right there. So it's that variable is storing the information, and that information that it's storing right now is my name. And that way you make your game a little bit more personable. Well, we need to also have a score. So I'm going to come back into my variables. I'm going to come in and create a score variable, and I can name it score. And I'm going to select the drop-down box to be number, and I'm going to set it as 0. By default, it's set to 0. I'll click OK. And now I'm going to come into my object, and I'm going to say, if they select this, we're going to adjust the variable because we're going to add some points to it. I'm going to select which variable we're adjusting, and it's going to be the score. And if I select the operator here, I'm going to add some points to it. I'm going to take the value that it's currently at, and I'm going to add 100 points to it. So if they get this question right, they automatically get 100 points, is what I'm doing here. Well, and then I need to navigate this one back to either or to the correct or incorrect feedback. So I'm going to add another trigger, and you'll use the show layer trigger a lot. And that's what I'm doing right now, is just using the show layer trigger. And I'm going to take them to my correct layer feedback and click OK. Come into my question one correct layer feedback and make sure that my continue button takes me back to the game board. So I'm going to click on this add a variable. I'm going to go in and take me to the show layer, and I'm going to go back to my game menu and click OK. Well, on my game menu, I want to display some score somewhere. So let me delete some things here. Let me just have one big text field. And let me go ahead and just inside of the percentage sign, open and close percentage sign, I'm going to type in the word score. And that way, it's going to show the score for the learner as they go throughout this game. So let's go ahead and hit preview. So I'm going to type in my name again, hit start game. So here's my score down at the bottom. It just says 0 for now. If I hit 1, click on the correct answer. There's my correct, hit continue. And now you see that it's automatically added the points to my score. Now we only have 6 minutes left, and this is just scratching the surface of what you can do inside of Storyline. And I wish we had a lot more time to go through. We can go into a lot more detail talking about these games and everything. One resource, if you're looking for if you're looking for more training on Storyline, eLearning Brothers just announced today, actually, a new course, How to Become an Articulate Storyline Ninja. If you go to that URL down at the bottom, you can actually go through all of this in detail. You can go through all of the variables, how to use all the variables, how to navigate to different pages, and everything like that. Also, a reminder for our template library, you don't have to even do all this programming. If you go into our template library and you subscribe to our template library, you actually can automatically just download these games already programmed for you, and you just have to just change out the text field, or you have to add your own little tweaks. And so if you go into the template library, we are going to be giving away a template library to everyone that's attended here. So everyone that's attended, you automatically get into our drawing, and we're going to give away a template library today, and we'll notify the user about if they've won a free year to our template library. And that way you get access to all of our activities, access to all of our interactions, access to all of our cutout people, access to all of our scenarios, all of our stock images. You get access to all of that. Well, if you don't win, just a reminder is we are giving away for everyone, we are giving away 10%, which the discount, it does end by the 8th of November at midnight. So if you want 10% off, go ahead and use this link right here that Parker has put in the chat window. But again, if you wanted to go through the training at this link, which I'll copy and paste this in. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste the link for here. Give me a second. And so that's the link for the training, but Parker does have a link for the 10% discount. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime, but that's all that I have. We don't have enough time to go through all the questions, but if you do have any questions, let me just type in my email here. Okay. And actually, I just got word that we're going to announce the winner now. So if you stay online, we're going to announce the winner now. If they want to stay late, you can do a Q&A session. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of comments here, but there's my email if you want to contact me. And after we announce the winner, I'm actually going to go through some of the questions. And if you want to stay late, I'm going to go through some of the questions that are still inside of the template light or still inside of the question. So go ahead and stick around for that if you have some questions that you want answered. If you haven't typed anything in yet, feel free to type those in, and we'll go through late, and I will go through and answer those questions. So let me just pass the headset back over to Dan, and he will announce the winner for the 1-year template library. But again, for those of you who don't win, go to this URL down at the bottom, and you can get the 10% off.
All right. Well, we've got a list here, and we want to make sure that the winner is actually online with us. So if you could give us some kind of indication if you're here, let's start with Elizabeth Israel. Are you with us, Elizabeth?
Tell her to type in the question. All right.
Elizabeth, if you could give us some feedback, if you're around, we'd love to give you a free membership to our template. We're going to give Elizabeth a 10-second countdown, and if not, we're going to go to Nancy Herbert. Nancy, are you with us?
She's there.
Oh,
Elizabeth Romero.
Oh. Elizabeth, you are with? Oh, no. Nancy Herbert. Sorry, Elizabeth Romero. It was actually Elizabeth Israel that we had called out. So Nancy Herbert, are you there?
Both Elizabeths are there. We're seeing them. All the chat right here.
Nancy Herbert, you're a winner. Hey, congratulations. We'll make sure you get that 1-year membership. We'll walk you through it. And folks, if you didn't win today, we just want to remind you that there is a 10% discount on the eLearning Brothers template library and really any eLearning Brothers product that you're interested in. Just in general, to let you know, the eLearning Brothers template library is very competitively priced. Less than a year ago, this library was priced at close to $2,500. So anyway, check in the next week with that discount code if you are interested in purchasing with a 10% discount. Thanks again for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. And we hope to partner again with Kurt Zilberscher of eLearning 2.0 to offer some different seminars. We obviously support a number of different authoring tools, and we look forward to doing that in the future. I'm getting a quick message from my co-presenter, Jeff, here.
All right, so I'm going to go through. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm going to go through and answer some of the questions if you do have a question. If you don't have any questions, you can feel free to sign off. Now, one of the questions here says, is there a way to pull data from my SQL database into storyline variable field? There is probably with some JavaScript code. I don't know how to do that exactly, but if you get into the execute JavaScript, you can probably do that. It's not the simplest thing to do. So I would actually recommend that you stay away from even trying to do that. But if you wanted to play around with that, the JavaScript command is probably the best way to do. What trigger do you use to change the state of that circle object back on the circle again? You would use the change state of trigger in order to do that. Are these variables for this story, or could we build out variable library in advance and draw from it as we need it in any future story build? Yeah, these variables you can use. You can build your own variables. It's basically up to you. I chose the ones that I wanted to use or made sense to me. But Storyline allows you to build your own type of variables. So you build game and different layers of one slide instead of multiple slides? Yes, because then I can contain that game all inside of one page instead of using multiple different pages. So it's a better structure, and somebody can probably argue to that, but that's the way that I found in building games is to keep it all on one page. When does and or function activate? Oh, this is awesome because and or basically says if you have more than one condition. So if you wanted to say, okay, go ahead and do this and or check for this and this and this. So if this is true and this is true and this is true, then do that. Or you can say, okay, if this is true or this is true. So one or the other has to be true in order for it to trigger. And means that all of them have to be true in order for it to trigger. The show layers trigger variable should be all created on one primary layer rather than each layer. No, the show layers basically depends on how you have it structured. If you have one button on a layer and you need to show another layer, then you need to add that trigger to show the other layer on the layer itself. So it just depends. Can we leverage the variable you set to control the show layer conditions for the next and back buttons? Seems a little heavy-handed or hard-coded than layer numbers, but I may be missing something. So yeah, you can use the variable to set, or you can just copy and paste in the next button inside of each layer. So it's if you wanted to do that. Can he email post the reason of the problem we had later as an example? Yes, I can definitely do that. We can email out the that issue that I had. I'm assuming it's just a trigger or something like that that I need to have in there. I didn't want to spend the time troubleshooting it, but you do have to troubleshoot when you're programming, so keep that in mind. Something like next should show current screen variable. Oh yeah. Are the variable names are there variable names you can't use? They're only the variable names that you can't use are ones with spaces. And Storyline won't even let you create that. What is the price of the template library? Well, if you buy it without the 10% discount, it is $2.99, and then it's 10% after that. Will the recording be emailed to attendees? That is yet to be determined. We will, if the recording is available, we will email that out to you. One person mentioned that they got up at 3 in the morning in Australia. I feel bad for you. I'm sorry, but I'm glad that you liked the webinar. Okay, I'm just making sure questions are okay. Jeff, do you hold a walkthrough on eLearning Brothers template library? Yes, we do that every week. If you go to our webinar page, which I'll actually show you here, if you go to eLearningBrothers.com, this is a way that you can see future webinars. We'll also post on eLearning 2.0, but if you click on webinars, right here, eLearning Brothers 101 helps you get started. The next one is on October 3rd. Actually, that was a one that already passed. November 6th is the next one, and that will walk you through on how to get started with all of ours. Do you have a French version? A French version of the training? I would assume that is your question. We don't at this time, no. With the timeline variable, what was the value referring to? The 1.0, 2.0, 3.0? That was the different timelines, navigating to the different timelines. That's what it was referring to, is the ability to go to a new timeline based on what variable it was actually, the current variable was at. So that's all the questions that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. As a reminder, here's the 10% discounts. It's posted in the chat window, as well as if you wanted access to our online training for all of Storyline. We have over 9 hours of videos on Storyline. Go ahead and check that out as well. But thank you, everyone.